The acrid smell of burnt canvas and charred belongings hung heavy in the desert air as 22-year-old Ayanna knelt among the smoldering remains of what had been her temporary home. The October wind swept across the Arizona landscape, carrying with it the last wisps of smoke from her destroyed tent. Everything she owned, her grandmother's woven baskets, the few photographs of her family, her meager supply of food, had been reduced to ash and twisted metal. "Get out and stay out, Apache." The words of the men who had done this still echoed in her ears. They had come at dawn, 3 ranch hands from the nearby Clearwater spread, claiming she was trespassing on private land. But Ayanna knew better. This patch of desert, near the dried creek bed where ancient cottonwoods still stood, had been neutral ground for generations. Her people had camped here long before any fences were erected. Now, as the morning sun climbed higher, casting harsh shadows across the red earth, she gathered what little had survived the fire. A dented water canteen, a torn blanket, and a small pouch containing her last few dollars, everything that remained of her attempt to make it on her own after leaving the reservation 6 months ago. The wind picked up, sending tumbleweeds rolling past her feet as she stood and surveyed the vast emptiness stretching in all directions. To the east lay the town of Cedar Ridge, where she'd found occasional work-cleaning houses for families who paid her little and trusted her less. To the west stretched endless desert, broken only by the silhouette of distant mesas, and to the north, barely visible through the heat haze, she could make out the weathered buildings of a small ranch. She'd seen the man who lived there once from a distance, a tall, lean figure working alone among his cattle. The locals in town called him Tom Brennan, and they spoke of him with a mixture of respect and pity. Respect for his hard work and honest dealings, pity for his solitary existence since his wife had died 3 years ago. Ayanna pulled the torn blanket tighter around her shoulders, feeling the weight of exhaustion settling in her bones. She hadn't slept in 2 days, afraid that the men might return. Now, with nowhere to go and the sun climbing toward its merciless peak, she had to make a choice. She could walk back to town and face the suspicious stares and whispered comments, or she could head toward the mountains and hope to find shelter in the wilderness her ancestors had called home. But as she stood there, indecision weighing on her like the heavy desert air, she noticed movement on the northern horizon. A dust cloud was approaching, kicked up by what looked like a single rider on horseback. For a moment, panic fluttered in her chest. What if it was one of the men returning to make sure she was gone? As the rider drew closer, she could see it wasn't one of her tormentors. This man sat straighter in his saddle, moved with purpose, but not aggression. His horse was a sturdy bay mare, well cared for but not flashy. When he was close enough for her to see his face clearly, she noticed the lines of concern etched around his blue eyes, the way his weathered hands gripped the reins with careful control. Tom Brennan brought his horse to a stop 20 feet away, his gaze taking in the scene of destruction without judgment. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 35, with sandy brown hair that showed streaks of premature gray at the temples. His clothes were simple, worn jeans, a faded blue shirt, and boots that had seen countless miles of hard ground. "Miss," he said, his voice carrying the slow, measured cadence of someone who chose his words carefully. "I saw the smoke from my place this morning. Are you hurt?" Ayanna straightened, drawing on the pride that had sustained her through months of rejection and hardship. "I'm fine," she replied, though the weariness in her voice betrayed her. Tom's eyes moved from her face to the ruins of her camp, then back again. She could see him processing what had happened, the calculations running behind his steady gaze. After a moment, he dismounted and pulled a water bottle from his saddlebag. "Water's clean," he said, holding it out to her. "You look like you could use some." The simple offer of kindness caught her off guard. In town, People crossed the street to avoid her. Here, a stranger was offering help without asking questions or making demands. She accepted the bottle gratefully, the cool water soothing her parched throat. "Thank you," she said, handing it back. Tom nodded, studying her face with the same careful attention he might give to an injured animal. "My name's Tom Brennan. I run the ranch north of here. And you are?" "Ayanna," she replied after a moment's hesitation. "Ayanna Begay." Well, Miss Begay," Tom said, settling his hat more firmly on his head. "It looks like you've had some trouble. Can't say I approve of what was done here." His jaw tightened slightly as he spoke, and she could hear genuine anger in his voice. This isn't right, no matter what anyone might claim about property lines. The unexpected support brought tears to her eyes, which she quickly blinked away. She'd grown used to defending herself, to facing hostility and indifference. Compassion was something she'd almost forgotten existed. "I should go," she said, shouldering her small bundle of salvaged belongings. "I don't want to cause you any trouble." "Where will you go?" Tom asked, his question direct but not intrusive. Ayanna looked around at the empty landscape, feeling the full weight of her isolation. "I'll figure something out," she said, trying to inject confidence into her voice. Tom was quiet for a long moment, his gaze shifting from her face to the ruins of her camp and back again. When he spoke, his words came slowly, as if he was working through a decision in real time. "I've got a section of land about 2 miles from my house," he said. "Near a year-round spring, good shelter from the wind. Been thinking about building a line shack there anyway, for when I'm working the far pastures." He paused, meeting her eyes directly. "If you're willing to help with the building, you're welcome to stay there once it's done. Won't be much, but it'll be sturdy and it'll be yours." The offer stunned her into silence. She searched his face for signs of ulterior motives, for the catch that always seemed to accompany kindness in her experience. But Tom's expression remained open and honest, patient as he waited for her response. "Why?" she asked finally. "You don't know me." "Don't know you," Tom agreed. "But I know what I see here, and I know it's wrong. My daddy always said a person's worth isn't measured by the color of their skin or the name of their people, but by how they treat others when no one's watching." He gestured toward the burned remains of her camp. "This tells me something about the men who did it, and your willingness to start over tells me something about you." Ayanna felt something loosening in her chest, a tension she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. For the first time in months, someone was offering her not just help, but respect. Still, caution held her back. "I can pay," she said. "Not much, but I can contribute something." Tom shook his head. "Your labor on the building will be payment enough. After that, what you do is your own business." He climbed back onto his horse, then looked down at her one more time. "Offer stands if you want it. I'll be at the spring site tomorrow morning at sunrise if you decide to take me up on it." As he rode away, leaving her alone with the smoldering ruins and the vast desert silence, Ayanna felt the first stirring of something she'd almost given up on: hope. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. She had a choice to make, and for the first time in a long while, one of her options didn't involve running away. The morning air carried a chill that made Ayanna pull her torn blanket closer as she made her way across the desert landscape. She'd spent a sleepless night among the ruins of her camp, wrestling with Tom's offer. Trust didn't come easily to her anymore. Too many promises had been broken, too many hands extended in false friendship only to be withdrawn when convenience demanded it. But as the first light of dawn painted the eastern sky in soft pastels, she found herself walking north, her few possessions bundled in what remained of her blanket. The spring Tom had mentioned wasn't hard to find. She could hear the gentle sound of running water long before she saw the cluster of cottonwoods that marked the spot. Tom was already there when she arrived, unloading lumber from a wagon hitched to two sturdy workhorses. He looked up as she approached, his face showing neither surprise nor satisfaction, just quiet acknowledgement, as if he'd expected her to come, but wouldn't have judged her if she hadn't. "Morning," he said, setting down a piece of rough-cut pine. "Coffee's still hot if you want some." She noticed he'd built a small fire and hung a battered pot over it. The smell of coffee mixed with the desert sage and the sound of running water created an unexpectedly peaceful atmosphere. It had been months since anyone had offered her coffee, since she'd felt welcome around another person's fire. "Thank you," she said, accepting the tin cup he offered. The coffee was strong and bitter, but the warmth was welcome. Tom moved with economical precision as he organized his materials, separating different lengths of lumber, checking his tools, measuring distances. She could see he'd done this kind of work before, could see the planning that had gone into this moment. "Structure's going to be simple," he said, sketching dimensions in the dirt with a stick. 12 by 16 feet, raised foundation to keep it off the ground when the rains come. Sloped roof to shed water, windows on the east and south sides for light and cross-ventilation. Ayana studied the rough diagram, noting how he'd positioned the cabin to take advantage of the natural windbreak provided by the largest cottonwood while still maintaining access to the spring. It was thoughtful design, the work of someone who understood the land and how to live with it rather than against it. "Where do we start?" she asked. The "we" seemed to please him. Tom straightened and handed her a pair of work gloves, worn leather that had been softened by years of use. "Foundation posts first. Ground's harder than it looks, so we'll have some digging ahead of us." The work was backbreaking. The desert soil, baked hard by decades of sun and infrequent rain, fought them for every inch. But Ayana found a rhythm in the labor, a satisfaction in the way her muscles remembered the patterns of hard work. Tom worked alongside her without comment, never suggesting she take the easier tasks, never treating her like she was fragile or incapable. By midday, they'd managed to dig 4 of the 8 post holes they'd need for the foundation. The sun beat down mercilessly, and sweat stained both their shirts dark. Tom called a halt, producing sandwiches and more coffee from his supplies. "You've done this before," he observed, noting the calluses on her hands, the way she'd learned to use her whole body's leverage when swinging the pickaxe. "Reservation School had a vocational program," Ayana replied, accepting half a sandwich gratefully. "Carpentry, mechanics, electrical work. They said it would help us find jobs in town." The bitterness in her voice was unmistakable. Tom chewed thoughtfully before responding. "Did you like the work itself?" The question caught her off guard. Most people, when they bothered to ask about her skills at all, focused on their utility, what she could do for them, how her abilities might serve their needs. No one had ever asked if she enjoyed the work. "Yes," she said after a moment. "I liked building things, making something useful out of raw materials. She paused, searching for the right words. "There's honesty in it. Wood doesn't lie about its strength. Nails either hold or they don't. It's not like dealing with people." Tom nodded slowly. "That's part of why I like ranching. Cattle are straightforward. They need water, grass, and shelter from the weather. Provide those things consistently and they'll trust you. Fail to provide them and they won't." He took another bite of his sandwich. "People are more complicated, but the basic principle still applies." They worked through the afternoon in companionable silence, the rhythm of their labor creating its own form of communication. When one needed a break, the other continued without judgment. When a particularly stubborn rock needed to be removed, they worked together without needing to discuss strategy. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, they stood back to survey their progress. 8 foundation holes, properly aligned and measured. Tomorrow they'd set the posts and begin framing. "You're welcome to make camp here by the spring tonight," Tom offered as he loaded his tools back into the wagon. "Water's good and there's plenty of deadfall for a fire." Ayana looked around at the peaceful spot with its sheltering trees and the gentle sound of flowing water. It felt safer than anywhere she'd been in months. "I'd like that," she said. Tom nodded and climbed onto his wagon seat. "I'll be back at sunrise. We'll have the frame up by tomorrow evening if the weather holds." As he drove away, leaving her alone with the approaching dusk and the sound of the spring, Ayana felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time, a sense of belonging somewhere. Not the belonging that came from birth or blood, but the kind that was earned through shared work and mutual respect. She gathered deadwood and built a small fire, then sat beside it as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. The desert around her was alive with the sounds of evening, the call of coyotes in the distance, the rustle of small creatures moving through the brush, the steady whisper of wind through the cottonwood leaves. For the first time in months, she wasn't afraid of the darkness. Tomorrow would bring more work, more progress towards something that would be hers. Not given out of pity or charity, but earned through her own efforts and skills. The thought filled her with a quiet satisfaction as she settled down to sleep, the sound of the spring singing her a gentle lullaby. 3 weeks into the construction, the cabin had begun to take shape. The foundation was solid, the frame squared and true, and the first rows of siding were nailed into place. What had started as an empty patch of desert beside the spring now looked like it could actually become a home. Ayana wiped sweat from her forehead as she stepped back to admire their morning's work. The east wall was nearly complete, and the window frame they'd installed caught the early light perfectly. She'd suggested the placement, remembering how her grandmother had always positioned windows to welcome the morning sun, and Tom had agreed without question. "Rain's coming," Tom said, studying the clouds building over the mountains to the west. "We should get the roof sheathing finished today if we can." They'd fallen into an easy working partnership over the past weeks. Tom's experience with construction complemented her eye for detail, and they'd discovered they shared a perfectionist streak that wouldn't allow them to settle for good enough when done right was possible. But more than that, they'd begun to trust each other. It had started with small things. Tom leaving his tools out overnight, trusting that Ayana would secure them if weather threatened. Ayana sharing stories about her grandmother's building techniques, knowledge passed down through generations. Gradually, their conversations had moved beyond the immediate work to touch on deeper subjects. "Tell me about your wife," Ayana said as they hoisted sheets of plywood onto the roof frame. The question came naturally, born of weeks of comfortable conversation, but she felt Tom tense beside her. For a moment, she thought he might not answer. They balanced the plywood sheet on the rafters, and Tom pulled out his tape measure to check the alignment before securing it with nails. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but steady. "Sarah," he said, driving nails with precise measured strokes. "She was a teacher in Cedar Ridge, 3rd grade. Loved kids, always talked about having our own someday." He paused, checking his work. "Cancer took her 3 years ago, ovarian. By the time we caught it, it was too late." Ayana worked beside him, giving him space to share or stay silent as he chose. She understood the weight of loss, the way grief could make even simple words feel too heavy to carry. "She would have liked this project," Tom continued after a while. "Sarah always said everyone deserved a place to call home, somewhere they could be safe and build a life." He looked up from his work, meeting Ayana's eyes directly. She taught me that kindness isn't charity, it's just recognizing that we're all in this together. She sounds like she was a wise woman, Ayana said simply. She was. Tom returned to his work, but the tension had left his shoulders. What about you? Family? It was Ayana's turn to pause, to weigh how much trust to extend. She'd shared bits and pieces of her story over the past weeks, but hadn't talked about the deeper wounds that had driven her from the reservation. My grandmother raised me, she said, measuring and cutting the next piece of sheathing. My parents died in a car accident when I was 7. Grandmother was traditional, taught me the old ways alongside the new. She believed in building bridges between worlds. She climbed onto the roof and positioned the plywood, Tom steadying it from below. The physical work made it easier to talk, gave her hands something to do while her mind navigated difficult memories. She died 2 years ago, heart attack. After that, I stayed on the reservation for a while, but... She paused, driving nails with more force than necessary. There were people who thought I was too traditional, others who thought I wasn't traditional enough. Got caught in the middle, you know? Decided I'd try making it in the outside world. Nah, how's that working out? Tom asked, and there was no sarcasm in the question, just genuine interest. Ayana laughed, but there was no humor in it. Well, my tent got burned down by racists, and I'm building a cabin with a lonely rancher, so, you know, mixed results. To her surprise, Tom laughed too, a real laugh that made his eyes crinkle at the corners. When you put it like that, it does sound like quite an adventure. They worked steadily through the morning, the rhythm of construction punctuated by easy conversation. Ayana found herself sharing stories about her grandmother's wisdom, about the traditional building techniques that emphasized harmony with the natural environment. Tom listened with genuine interest, sometimes asking questions that showed he was really thinking about what she said. By noon, they had the roof sheathed and were ready to install the metal roofing Tom had bought in town. The work required them to coordinate closely, one person holding sheets in place while the other secured them. Trust became not just emotional but practical. A misplaced step or a moment of inattention could result in serious injury. You're good at this, Tom observed as Ayana expertly aligned a roofing panel, better than some professionals I've worked with. Grandmother used to say that if you're going to do something, do it with your whole heart, Ayana replied. Half-hearted work creates problems later. As if to emphasize her point, the first fat raindrops began to fall, pattering against the freshly installed metal roof. They'd finished just in time. Tom climbed down from the roof and stood beside her, both of them looking up at the cabin that was taking shape. It's starting to look like a real home, he said. Ayana nodded, feeling a deep satisfaction as the rain began to fall more steadily, running off the roof in clean sheets instead of dripping through gaps. They'd built something solid, something that would endure. But as she stood there in the increasing downpour, she realized that more than just the cabin was taking shape. Over the past weeks, something had been building between her and Tom, not romance, but something equally valuable, friendship, trust. The kind of partnership that came from shared work and mutual respect. The rain was falling harder now, and they took shelter under the wide eaves of the cabin. Lightning flickered in the distance, followed by the slow roll of thunder. The desert around them came alive with the smell of wet earth and sage. "Thank you," Ayana said suddenly, the words coming from a deep place she'd kept carefully guarded. Not just for the cabin, but for seeing me as a person, for treating me like I matter. Tom was quiet for a moment, watching the rain transform the desert landscape. When he spoke, his voice carried the same careful sincerity she'd come to associate with him. "We all matter," he said simply. "Sometimes we just need someone to remind us." As they stood there together, watching the storm bring life to the desert, Ayana felt something shift inside her. For months, she'd been running from pain, from disappointment, from the crushing weight of feeling like she belonged nowhere. But here, in this place they'd built together, she felt the possibility of something different. Not running from, but building toward. The storm would pass, as storms always did, but what they'd created together, the cabin, the friendship, the quiet understanding that had grown between them, would endure. And for the first time in a very long time, that felt like enough. 2 months after Tom found Ayana among the ashes of her burned tent, she stood in the doorway of her completed cabin, watching the November sunrise paint the desert in gold and rose. The cabin was everything Tom had promised, sturdy, weatherproof, and undeniably hers. Inside, the space was simple but functional, with a wood-burning stove, shelves filled with books and supplies she'd gathered from her work around town, and a chair positioned by the window to catch the morning light. But beyond the physical structure, what made the cabin special was the bond it had fostered between Ayana and Tom, built through shared labor and respect. As part of their routine, Tom stopped by most mornings, bringing coffee and conversation as they discussed the day ahead. On one such morning, Tom shared news from town. Johnson at the hardware store was looking for a carpenter after their regular handyman left. Tom had already recommended Ayana, and Johnson was interested in meeting her. The offer meant more than just work. It was a chance for Ayana to be accepted into the community. Later, as they sat on the porch, Tom mentioned he had been considering subdividing the land and selling it. Ayana feared she might lose the land, but Tom reassured her, offering to sell it to her instead with reasonable owner financing, acknowledging the work she'd put into the cabin. Ayana is stunned, as true ownership is something she never thought possible. She admits she can't afford much of a down payment, but Tom reassures her, saying her labor on the cabin counts for something. He also mentions that if she works for Johnson, she'll have steady income to cover the payments. Tom hands her a document that outlines the terms, which Ayana examines carefully, recognizing that the terms are fair with no hidden clauses. Confused, Ayana asks, "Why?" Tom explains that he and his late wife, Sarah, had once dreamed of a community where people supported each other, not just coexisted. This offer, he believes, is a step in that direction. Over the next few weeks, Ayana's life falls into place. Johnson hires her based on Tom's recommendation, and her work in the community, repairing fences, building storage solutions, and even designing a display case for the town's museum, helps her integrate into the town. People who once avoided her now seek her advice, and children who had once stared at her now wave hello. In December, Ayana finalizes the purchase of the land with Tom by her side. They go to the county courthouse to sign the papers, and afterward, as they walk back to his truck, Ayana feels a deep sense of completion. Tom, smiling, mentions that Sarah would have been proud, as she always believed in helping others. As Ayana reflects on the journey that brought her here, she realizes how far she's come. 6 months ago, she had nothing, but now she has a home, work that fulfills her, and a community that has accepted her. The cabin, which was once just a shelter, has become the foundation of a life she's building. That evening, as she watches the sunset over the land that now legally belongs to her, Ayana remembers her grandmother's words. Home isn't just a place you come from, it's a place you choose to be. She has chosen this place, this life, and this community, and in return, they have chosen her. The ashes of her burned tent have been scattered by the desert winds, but from that destruction has come something much stronger. A home built on kindness and shared humanity. The cabin stands solid and warm around her, its walls holding not just her belongings, but her dreams for the future. The desert, once empty of possibility, now stretches before her with new opportunities to contribute to her community. Tonight, she is simply home,